IVT's Validation Week is going virtual for 2020 this October. Not to be confused with a single presentation webinar or Zoom training, Val Week 2020 brings a completely virtual 3-day conference experience. With nearly 30 expert speakers and a combination of live and on-demand sessions crafted with your time in mind, the caliber of training content is unrivaled. Hear from top pharma, biotech, and medical device subject matter experts, gain exclusive insights from FDA speakers, build up your team's validation toolkit with take-home checklists and materials, and leverage unlimited networking opportunities with colleagues and key decision makers. Plus, claim up to 15 credit hours toward GMP training requirements. You won't want to miss it. Visit www.informaconnect.com/validation week for all details on agenda and registration. Once again, that's www.informaconnect.com/validation-week for all event details.
This is the United Podcast Network.
This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation, brought to you by the IVT Network. Each week, we bring you timely interviews with life science experts and discussions focused on trending topics, frequently asked questions, and industry best practices. This week, we are pleased to welcome Emma Ramnarine, who's here to talk with us about One Voice of Quality. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you, Stacey. Really happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. And I'm excited to talk about this topic. For our listeners, post-approval changes are part of the drug development lifecycle, and that's no surprise as drug makers gain new knowledge and work toward continuous improvement. But as we've seen during this pandemic, managing high volume of post-approval changes in a short time frame has been a considerable challenge. So this global problem requires a global solution. And Emma, our guest today, has a solution that she's been working on with some of her partners, and she's going to share that with us during our discussion. So how exciting to get brand new cutting edge information here on our podcast, Emma. Before we jump in here, though, I really want to set the stage a bit for our listeners. In pharma, the idea of life cycle approach to product development, ongoing process verification of post-qualification batches, statistically driven criteria development, and data-driven decision-making across all stages of the process validation life cycle have become industry norms. Yet, here we are, and we still see a lack of regulatory flexibility to post-approval changes. And I'm hoping that you can really give us the history of that so we can kind of understand, where we've come from and why this solution is such an important one.
Yes, Stacey. Actually, this topic of life cycle management is really not new, right? So if you look at a product can, after it is developed and launched, it can live in its commercial life cycle for sometimes upwards of 20 plus years, right? And so when a product is launched, you obviously have a certain amount of knowledge, but during this long commercial life of a product, you continue to gain new knowledge, right, throughout the daily operations. So this concept of a life cycle approach, whether it's for validation, continuous verification, or if it is for an equipment life cycle or the control system life cycle, this is really not new, right? I would say, though, that even though the concept is not new, the implementation maturity of that concept over the last 5 to 7 years has really started growing. So on the one hand, we're seeing a lot of advances with technologies, personalized healthcare, digitization. You'll hear Industry 4.0, and that's great in getting new products out to market. So innovation is really encouraged in meeting unmet medical needs with new products. But I'll ask the question, what about innovating existing products that have been in their commercial life cycle for 20 plus years, right?
Right.
So quality systems are evolving, but our regulatory systems are maybe not catching up in the same way in terms of meeting these needs for innovation for both new and existing products. So companies are globalizing, as we all know.
Right.
You know, we have products that are approved sometimes in 100 plus countries. And each of these countries has their health authorities. And what we're seeing more and more is that these health authorities are regionalizing. Their regulatory frameworks are becoming stronger. But as these frameworks become stronger, those regional requirements and expectations are also becoming more rigid, right? So we asked the question then, Industry 4.0, and Brendan Cuddy from EMA in one of the conferences has said, what about regulatory 4.0, right? How could we think about moving our regulatory frameworks in a direction that could catch up with these advances? Now, you mentioned COVID-19. I think COVID-19 has definitely highlighted one thing for me and for the folks that have been talking about this topic of post-approval changes, that really diseases know no borders, right? Science
Right.
knows no borders. Patients and public health are really country agnostic. Every patient anywhere in the world should get every single dose of their product and medicine on time, every time that they need it. So it's been encouraging to see some actions from the health authorities to deal with this crisis, and we could talk about that a little bit more. But I would say there's definitely a lot more that's needed.
Right. I would definitely agree. I think it is encouraging, though, that during this pandemic, this time of this pandemic, we have seen regulators come together to move things along more quickly, to be more collaborative, to exactly to your point, to meet the needs of the patient, in a desperate hour, so to speak. So in terms of this particular one voice of quality topic, I've heard you refer to the wicked problem caused here by drug shortages, a need for continual improvement, and the current global regulatory framework. So can you help our listeners understand this quagmire?
Yeah, the wicked problem is a very interesting term, and I got exposed to it reading an article from Riddle and Weber that was written in 1973. And what they define a wicked problem is something that is highly complex, difficult to define, and highly resistant to solutions. On top of that, it is too large to be solved by any one group of stakeholders. So if I can throw out a few relevant examples, if you think about climate change, financial crisis, sustainability, income disparity, these are examples that are called out for wicked problems, and they take a lot of policy change and involvement from a lot of stakeholder groups. In 2016, Anders Winther wrote about drug shortages as a wicked problem, and that led me to saying, all right, well, let me explore why drug shortages is really a wicked problem. And as we looked into it, Riddle and Weber had talked about 10 characteristics of a wicked problem. So let me run through these really quickly.
Yes, please. Right.
You can then start seeing how these linkages between these characteristics and drug shortages make drug shortages a wicked problem. So first, every problem is unique. And if we look at it, each drug shortage is unique and it's different from others, right? So that's one. Second is it's difficult to define. Today, if you look at it, there are 56 known definitions of shortages. I'm sure there are more. And the reason there are 56 definitions is because not all stakeholders agree on these. The third is a wicked problem is multi-causal, and there is high interdependency or interconnectedness between the causes. So for shortages, you'll hear of economic, business, manufacturing related, quality related, supply chain related causes. All true. However, it's really hard to draw a cause-effect relationship between the problem and the cause, right? So what that means is For every shortage, it is handled differently. It's handled differently in different countries. It's handled by different stakeholders differently. Pharma will say, hey, it's the global regulatory complexity. Regulators will say it's manufacturing and quality issues. At the end of the day, all of it is true, but the truth beneath all of it is that these are interconnected and multi-causal issues.
Right.
The fourth is multiple stakeholders are involved. So if you think about our world, manufacturers, marketing authorization holders, regulators, suppliers, wholesalers, distributors, healthcare providers, advocacy groups, policymakers, all of these are stakeholder groups. And if you look at that group, they're all widely dispersed, sometimes having conflicting agendas. It's hard to get a common shared understanding of the problem. Not only that, there are weak communication channels between these stakeholders, and sometimes the solutions are only geared towards their particular angle. A couple of years ago, EMA put together an inter-association drug shortages task force. They brought in a lot of the stakeholders together, but still not all stakeholders participated. Fifth, the problem is socially complex and it usually straddles across organizational and disciplinary boundaries. Drug shortages really do affect society's well-being, and even if all stakeholders want the same thing, our infrastructure and organizational elements really do not bring these stakeholders together to solve in a collaborative, integrative manner. Really, we need to have courage to step across these organizational boundaries and disciplinary boundaries, and in some cases, give up our local solutions for the greater global good. Sixth, the problem is not stable. It's connected to other problems. So, for example, you could say global complexity causes slowness of innovation, and that slowness of innovation then can potentially lead to drug shortages. Seventh, any attempts to address these shortages leads to unforeseen consequences. Another example I can give here is, there's been an increase in local and regional regulatory frameworks, all well-intentioned to meet the country-specific needs, but it increases global complexity. Right. There are varying levels of data and documentation requirements. Changes are categorized differently. Approval timelines are different. In one country, you can expect approval in 30 to 90 days. In another country, it takes 730 days, as an example, right? So until
it's a huge difference. Yeah, right.
Huge difference. Until all countries approve, that change cannot move forward. The other thing about wicked problems is the solutions are not right or wrong, but they are better or worse. Right? So these solutions vary greatly. They tend to be one-shot solutions. It's not a one-size-fits-all, and you really cannot test the goodness or effectiveness of the solutions. So you don't really know if that solution is truly meeting all the needs that need to be met. You just know if it's making things better or worse. It can take a long time to evaluate these solutions, because, again, as I mentioned, there isn't a direct cause-effect relationship between the problems and the solutions. And really, a lot of times they need behavioral changes to make these solutions work. And finally, the 10th characteristic is this problem is never fully solved. It's called the no-stopping rule. So you just keep moving and going through one solution after another and see if it makes things better or worse. So there are really no short-term answers. It takes a long-term commitment, and it'll take longer-term strategies to address. So that's what makes drug shortages a complex, wicked problem.
Absolutely. I mean, hearing you describe all of the different components, I can understand why it would be classified as a wicked problem. It's challenging. It's funny because the regulators from all the every different country, they're trying to do the best they can, make the best decisions on behalf of the people in that country or in that region. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is they're doing a disservice to their own citizens and to, the global community, because it is really slowing down a process that could move much more quickly and efficiently if everybody was playing for the same team, right?
You know what? And the truth is, Stacey, we are all playing for the same team because it's the patient at the end. And
Right.
our common objective is really ensuring reliable and sustainable supply of quality medicines to these patients. Regulators want that. Industry
Of course.
wants that. Everybody wants that. But I think the complexity really gets in the way. So what's really needed is this dialogue and shared understanding and collaboration from all stakeholders, because the bottom line goal is the same.
Right. I would agree, for sure, for sure. So thinking about the current post-approval change process, it's easy to understand then how delays in continual improvement can occur. Now we're adding in, of course, the current environment of COVID-19, and this problem is escalated, right? So what have regulators done to change PAC management during this pandemic?
Such a relevant topic in these times, right, Stacey?
It really is.
The worldwide outbreak of COVID-19 has demonstrated that our current global regulatory framework for managing post-approval changes is really not capable of handling a pandemic, right? I don't think anybody will argue this. But I would also say that out of crisis emerges creative thinking. And we are seeing that. So to prevent shortages, because it really comes down to supply, to prevent shortages, we've had to move from standard ways of working to a business continuity mode in order to ensure that these medicines can be supplied to patients. So I have to commend regulators for striving to find solutions in this environment. So the European Commission, I'll give a couple of examples. The European Commission and the heads of medicines agencies put out this Q&A on expedited change management process. And they did that really quickly, and this allows guidance for how can you expedite changes for certain types, how can you expedite certain types of post-approval changes, and what are some requirements in that space. So we can talk about that a little bit further. FDA put out the emergency use authorization as you're seeing them do this. Of course, still all based on science. FDA also put out a guidance on high absenteeism. So basically, still the focus from all of these remains that post-approval changes that are going towards providing crucial medicines for COVID-19 patients. As you can see for emergency use authorization, that those are expedited as quickly as possible. There are also post-approval changes that are addressing disruptions because of the pandemic. So FDA has taken some steps in that direction. And then also based on the risk and medical necessity, some of these post-approval changes that are considered prior approvals, and they need prior approval from a health authority before implementation, have been downgraded to be notifications. So common themes, why have they been able to do so is really focus on supply.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because we have seen this, as you mentioned, too, with the FDA, with all the emergency use authorizations. And we know, even though we're still in the middle of the pandemic, I think we all kind of understand that at some point, all of these temporary guidances are going to go away, and we're going to go back to where we were prior to the pandemic in terms of the guidances that we have, unless they're formally changed, permanently. Do you think? I mean, I don't want to get off tangent, but do you think some of these post-approval change, these steps forward that we've seen during the pandemic, are going to remain?
They should. Some of these should become our new norm, Stacey, because I think the concept of risk-based decision-making, right? That shouldn't go away. That risk-based decision-making is not just unique to the pandemic. We deal with risks on a daily basis, right? And so how do you integrate that? How do you integrate risk management? How do you leverage the quality system? How do you leverage the role of quality? So for example, in the European Commission's new process for in this COVID-19 situation, they highlighted the role of quality in making the right product quality, patient safety decisions, where they required the QP, the qualified person in Europe, to be approving the application of formal risk management within their companies, and documenting those decisions in the quality system. I don't see why these aspects cannot be retained even after the pandemic, right? They're all really relevant and not unique to COVID-19.
Agreed, because there's disasters of all different kinds that we've seen impact, manufacturing and access to drugs. So very valid point. So Emma, if real-time change is needed to innovate, continually improve and ensure drug availability, how do we make RealTime Pack a reality and not just, something that's up for discussion? What are the barriers that you've seen in getting us there to that point?
Great question, Stacey, because one, I think companies really need to move closer to real-time implementation of new knowledge that you gain on a daily basis. This is absolutely essential to innovate, continually improve, and ensure that supply. We need to be going from years to weeks and months for approval of these changes, and we need to be reducing the number of changes that go from prior approval to notifications. So what this requires is fundamentally risk-based decision-making by company and regulators, right? Now, one can say, hey, we've implemented quality risk management, but I would say really not. If we want to move towards this ambition of a transformational shift in post-approval change management timelines, I would throw out there, why should we not look for a 50% reduction in prior approval changes? And why should we not look for going from years to weeks and months for implementing these changes? Now, in order to do that, beside the risk-based decision-making, trust and transparency is foundational. So the question is, how can we in the industry build trust with regulators so that more post-approval changes can be managed in the company's quality system? In other words, how can a company be trusted to make the post-approval change decision that today resides with the regulatory authority, right? ICHQ 10 Annex 1, which is, by the way, little known, I wish people would go and read that one. It says if a company can demonstrate an effective quality system, product and process understanding, and application of risk management, then they can use optimized science and risk-based approaches for post-approval changes to get regulatory flexibility. Right now, that hasn't been realized today.
Right.
So the question is, what can companies do and what can regulators do? So I'll just touch on a few things that companies can do. One is apply risk management with the latest product and process knowledge that you know from your daily operations. Really utilize risk-based decision-making. Document this in your quality system and really demonstrate that your quality system is effective in doing so. For regulators, I would say the first step is, again, science and risk-based application, not country-specific and not generic. I mean, using the company's latest product and process knowledge to say, hey, company A, you have really good controls and you've shown through your risk management that you can manage this well within your quality system. So you get the ability to downgrade versus company B for the very same change. If they aren't able to demonstrate that, then that needs to be a prior approval. So that's where using the company's knowledge, using the company's risk-based approach and PQS, you can do that. Also would be great to see more interactions between assessors and inspectors, because assessors review changes, inspectors review the quality system. It'd be great to have more dialogue between the two so the inspectors can inform how well the quality system is doing for a company. And eventually, I do hope we get to regulatory reliance between health authorities, where it would be one change approved by one country could be accepted by others. This will help with the speed. So we need to bring both the numbers down and bring the speed up for these changes.
I would agree. And so it sounds like you're saying, maybe a first step down that path is for drug manufacturers really to start working towards this, proving how trustworthy they are in terms of their process and the quality that they can bring, not because the regulators there are looking over their shoulder, but because they're leveraging all of the knowledge that they have, and they are recording that correctly, so they can really prove at the end of the day that they're reliable to make these changes without going through a whole chain of command. Is that correct?
Yes, trust has to be earned, right, Stacey? So
Yeah,
the goal is
100%. I agree. And there's some companies who have done this very well historically, and then there's others who have had some challenges, let's say, and may not right now be viewed in the most trustworthy light, right? And so the regulators are concerned about the whole. They're right now, they're not really looking at individual companies, but they're saying, we know there's problems. And so while there's problems, we're going to, have a hard stance, take a long look at every company.
That's true. I mean, the bottom line goal, Stacey, is 1, faster approvals, 2, less countries approving, and 3, fewer changes requiring prior approval.
Right. So that leads us to then this concept that you've developed called One Voice of Quality, which essentially requires the pharmaceutical industry to work together to demonstrate that product and process knowledge and systems, as you were just talking about, are strong enough to allow for independent post-approval changes. So we've just talked about what that is, but I'm going to follow up and ask you, why is this such a novel or unique idea in the industry?
Yeah. So what I would say, Stacey, my journey with this whole topic started with, it comes down to risk-based application, right? It started with the topic of drug shortages. And as you pull the thread, you go, why do we have drug shortages? Well, we can't change too fast because it takes too long. And if it takes too long, why does it take too long? Because we're too complex. The global landscape is too complex. So neither the complexity is new, nor the fact that risk management should be applied is new, right? The unintended consequence of all of that is it goes counter to the goal of doing things to continually improve, innovate, and ensure product availability. When I was heading up global analytical science and technology in my role prior to this, it was really frustrating to see how long it takes to even make simple changes when that change is making things better. It's moving, it's improving the availability for patients, it's improving compliance, it's improving, it's reducing the risk, in fact, to patients. And yet sometimes it can take 8 to 10 years to implement across the globe. By the time that's implemented, that technology is no longer new. Right. So
I was just going to say, by the time it gets through all of these, all of these approvals, like you are well past that solution and on to, the 10th or 11th edition of that.
Absolutely. So basically what needs to happen is the industry needs to demonstrate 2 things. One, that we have an effective quality system that is capable of handling these changes within the company. And 2, that we're really utilizing the latest product and process knowledge in our risk-based decision making. So this One Voice of Quality effort focuses on these 2 aspects with really practical examples. It is applying the ICH Q9, Q10, and Q12 concepts, and it is aligned with the latest thinking around this, even with WHO, right? Because WHO is outside of the ICH region. The difference, what makes it novel is, one, the industry is aligning not only on these standard solutions, but they're also aligning with their commitment to implement these consistently. So with the chief quality officers from 20 plus countries deciding to speak with one voice in developing these standard solutions and then committing to implement them, hopefully the regulators can start seeing the industry doing our part in earning that trust and in earning that flexibility.
That makes total sense. And it sounds like that's there's going to have to be this collaboration and this, one voice, but also this sharing of knowledge, so that we can help every manufacturing or every drug maker to establish
Yep.
this kind of trust that you're talking about. And so it sounds like you're saying that post-approval change process, which typically takes months or even years, as you were alluding to, can now be completed in a matter of days or weeks. And I hear you saying that, but talk a little bit about how you envision that actually happening, right? So in the whole concept that you're discussing makes sense. And I really could see us moving towards that, but how do we actually make that happen?
So yes, we can be much faster. We need to be much faster, Stacey.
Of course.
Science. So bottom line is the science and risk basis does not change with country. The patient needs do not change with the country.
Right.
So a situation when a change reduces patient risk, it improves compliance or improves our processes, should be able to be implemented in days within your quality system. And if you use the construct of an effective quality system, then what that means is there is no prior approval required. And if there is no prior approval required, then it doesn't need to wait for every country to approve it before that change can be implemented. So how do we need to make this happen? It's really the quality system within a company needs to provide the framework. Now, ICH Q10 has been out for a while, but Q10 never really says how do you demonstrate an effective quality system? So it says you need to have a quality system, and here are the elements of the quality system, but how do you demonstrate that that quality system is effective? So the One Voice of Quality solutions are really building on ICH Q9, Q10, and this role of quality, and Q12 as well, to align and standardize the industry on 4 things. And these are the 4 specific things that are the hows on where we can get there. 1, there is a standard science and risk-based approach that is being put out, and that is published in the paper that just came out in the PDA journal.
Right.
Application of this science and risk-based approach is being done, second, for every single type of post-approval change example. So we're actually developing practical examples that can be used standard across the industry. The third is coming to the quality system. The paper talks about how do you demonstrate exactly that the quality system is effective in managing the changes within the system as opposed to requiring prior approval. So these are the main 3. And then the last one is all well and good that the industry can do this, but we need to talk to the regulators.
Right.
So once we have these solutions, we really need to be engaging with the regulators, both reviewers and inspectors. And we've had great engagement with PICS. And PICS recently put out a paper on how to demonstrate an effective risk-based change management system. Great checklist approach. So I think what we're seeing, how to make this happen, is these practical, tangible tools. The ICH guidances give the concepts, but now we've got to get them down to the floor level and say, how do you actually implement these? And that's where One Voice of Quality is really playing a big role.
It sounds like it. It's really going to be. It's really going to be the catalyst for helping manufacturers understand how to carry out this task, right? So if you give them the tools and teach them how to use them, then they can, hopefully reproduce this in their organization. And so as we talk about post-approval change complexity, it seems to me that manufacturers with products who are sold globally are the ones that are hit the hardest. So what happens to these manufacturers then, their ability to innovate and to, public health as a whole, make changes or positive impact to public health as a whole if nothing changes? If we can't move towards this one quality of voice, can you talk about the impact that's going to have on manufacturers?
I'll tell you, the impact is happening even now. We live with it, right, on a daily basis. So here's the deal, Stacey. New knowledge is gained in our daily operations, right?
Sure.
So you're learning things about this product through our processes, our methods. So when you get new knowledge, you go, hey, I can improve that. I can be much better, much faster, improve yields. I can reduce risks. I can improve compliance. So continuous improvement is desired and expected. Yet it is taking us years to implement this new knowledge. It's almost like I know I can make this better, but I really can't do it because it's too hard to do it. So in order to achieve this objective of reliably producing high quality products, we need to do three things. One, implement new knowledge in a timely manner. Two, continually improve and innovate when we get this new knowledge and do it fast. And three, both of these things need to happen without increasing the risk to patient or product quality, right? That's
key. That is the number one, right?
That is number one. Even though I stated number three, I think that is number one, that needs to as long as that is maintained, you should be able to implement new knowledge and continually improve. So like I said, as companies are globalizing, ideally, we're looking for one product for the whole world. Yet with the 100+ approvals for a global product, a company ends up with many variations of the same product depending on which country has approved it. So there's a pre-change version and a post-change version. You cannot send the post-change version to a country that hasn't approved that change. So this ends up being a logistical nightmare, rife with errors, where you also run the risk of sending an unapproved product to a country. I do want to be clear, there's nothing wrong with the product if it's not approved. It's been approved by other countries. It's just not been approved by that particular country. So this is what can result in things like shortages. We know there are better technologies, there are better processes, but there needs to be better incentive as well to implement these. This really has to change because, as I talked about, that common objective that we all work for remains the same in terms of supplying safe, effective medicines for patients all the time.
Right. And we hear about, some countries having challenges with access to certain kinds of drugs, especially during a global pandemic or a crisis like this. And so it would seem that this whole concept, this one voice of quality concept and its implementation would help to alleviate some of those access issues.
I believe it will.
Yeah. Definitely. For sure. So Emma, we've talked a lot about this concept and a little bit about how it could be carried out. In order to move forward or toward real-time packs as a reliable risk-based decision-making process would need to be created, I'm assuming. And our industry has moved as a whole to a risk-based approach across the life cycle. So that we have seen happening. So is this really just an extension of that kind of thinking?
In theory, yes, Stacey. In practice, we have a long way to go, both for the industry and regulators. And, I could say that ICH Q9 on quality risk management came out in 2005, right? It's 15 years.
Right.
We've learned a lot in terms of doing risk assessments. So there are risk assessments being done across the industry. But we're still far from risk-based decision-making. So let me say a few things about what I mean by that. So we're using basic QRM application. We're doing risk assessment tools, FMEAs. They're shown to regulators, done by companies. However, the science and databases in these risk assessments can sometimes be still weak. The risk assessments are performed by companies, but they may not be updated on an ongoing basis with the latest product and process knowledge, right? That you're acquiring through your operations. Risk-based decisions may be being made by regulators, but the change categorization is based on a generic risk understanding. They're not taking the product and process knowledge and current risk controls, current experience from the company in determining the change categorization. Effectiveness of the quality system is not considered as part of the decision making. And then the biggest one I would say is the risks remain the same, but different decisions are being made for the same level of risk, right? Both within the industry and on the regulator side. So typically, whenever you think of risk, it carries a negative connotation. So you end up making decisions based on the worst case scenario that could be possible, as opposed to using the real-time product and process knowledge. And what this ultimately ends up with is the risk-benefit balance is really not achieved, right? So there may be a risk, but if the benefit is higher, how do you take that into account in the risk-based decision-making? So we have a long ways to go in terms of our risk-benefit assessments that we do.
Sure.
Again, I'd come down to it's really that wicked problem. And I'm not saying it's about the cause or saying which stakeholder group needs to solve it. Industry can't say regulators need to fix at their end, or policymakers. Regulators can't say industry needs to do it. Policymakers can't look at the regulators only. So, it's a multifaceted situation where we really need integrative and collaborative solutions. The good news is that the dialogue has opened up, the awareness is building. And so even though a lot more needs to be done, we have started the journey. We're still early in the journey, and we do need to move fast for the sake of patients.
I agree. I mean, and it sounds like, I'm excited that there has been, a beginning dialogue, because to solve any problem, especially one of this magnitude, you do need that collaborative effort, and you can't, unless all the stakeholders are at the table, right, being part of the solution, yep, then you're just never really going to get there, because there's always going to be something holding you back. So, and that all begins with discussions and some consensus.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, this has been great so far. I know I want to give you a second to leave some last thoughts with our listeners. But before you do that, I also want to give a little plug for the next episode that we're going to do together with Anders to talk about this in more detail. So I want you to be able to give a little plug for listeners so they know what to look forward to. And then, of course, we'll close out with any last thoughts that you might have for our listeners.
Great. I'll keep it simple, Stacey. I think in terms of the next episode, we'll talk a lot more in the details around the risk-based approach. What do we mean by enhanced risk-based decision-making? What about the solutions and examples? So we'll spend a lot more time there. I would also invite people to join the dialogue. The more people that are in this dialogue, the more awareness and difference that we can make. So if folks need to reach out to any of us that want to learn more about it, I would invite, I don't know how you would put the contact information.
We can put it all in the show notes. Right. We'll put it all in the show notes.
Yeah. So I would invite folks to join the dialogue.
Fantastic. And I think, you know what, that's how we're going to solve the problem, with everybody joining the discussion. So that sounds great. And that's a great way to leave us for today, Emma. So thank you so much for being our guest and for sharing this really groundbreaking idea with us. I can't wait to hear a little bit more about it the next time we chat.
Thank you, Stacey.
Thanks. I also want to say thank you to Ben Kitchen, our producer, and the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. Lastly, big shout out to you, our valued listeners. If you have a topic request or a guest suggestion, we'd love to hear from you on that. And if you enjoyed today's episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice, and don't forget to share it with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. We really do appreciate you helping us spread the word. For today's show notes and information on this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com. We'll be back again next week with another great episode. Until then, stay healthy and safe.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.
IVT's Validation Week is going virtual for 2020 this October. Not to be confused with a single presentation, webinar, or Zoom training. Val Week 2020 brings a completely virtual 3-day conference experience. With nearly 30 expert speakers and a combination of live and on-demand sessions crafted with your time in mind, the caliber of training content is unrivaled. Hear from top pharma, biotech, and medical device subject matter experts, gain exclusive insights from FDA speakers, build up your team's validation toolkit with take-home checklists and materials, and leverage unlimited networking opportunities with colleagues and key decision makers. Plus, claim up to 15 credit hours toward GMP training requirements. You won't want to miss it. Visit www.informaconnect.com/validation week for all details on agenda and registration. Once again, that's www.informaconnect.com/validation-week for all event details.